Hi. With all the ferment over 9/11 and Islam, I thought that I'd take a few minutes um, to read a little on the history of Islam, just so that that becomes common knowledge. So I'm going to read some excerpts from this book by Bertold Spuler, written in 1969, called The Age of the Caliphs. These are just some excerpts from the beginning sections. And I'll be reading straight to that document right there, looking right there. Arabia, the peninsula stretching between Egypt, Abyssinia, Persia, Syria, and Mesopotamia, might well have formed a center of gravity in world politics, but for the great drawback of its physical characteristics. Most of the country is desert, and only in the far south and at the northeast extremity did Abyssinia and Persia succeed in acquiring bases. Only certain coastal stretches were accessible to higher civilization, and had indeed over many centuries developed such a civilization of their own, though this was already in decline. The outside world was content to let Arab caravans bring their country's chief products to Syria and Mesopotamia and take the risk of travel through its unpopulated expanses. One of the commercial centers of the country, the city of Makkah, Mecca, thus became one of its political hubs also. The local merchants had built up an aristocratic mercantile republic and had known how to exploit a local sanctuary, the Kaaba, for their commercial ends. In view of its importance as the emporium for a great part of Arabia, the city with its environs was regarded as inviolable, and the merchants had brought about that several months of each year were considered sacred. In them caravan traffic could proceed without danger of attacks by competitors or Bedouin, that section of the population which was accustomed to free and unrestricted roaming in the broad, lonely spaces, and lived according to its own desert-determined laws. Organized into separate tribes under sheikhs, who in turn formed tribal alliances on the basis of real or fictitious kinship, the main concerns of the Bedouin were the preservation in all circumstances of tribal unity, though outsiders might be adopted into the tribe, the most far-reaching hospitality, and the vendetta as a guarantee of survival. Every man must know that killing a member of another tribe would bring retribution, not only on the murderer, but also on the whole of the murderer's tribe. But since in the frequent desert skirmishes, in fights over waterholes and flocks, cases of violent killing were bound to occur, a chain of blood feuds, each leading in turn to further retaliation, stretched through Bedouin history, sometimes to be broken by larger clashes between various groups. Between the two elements of the population, the merchants and the Bedouin, a passable relationship had been worked out, as each was dependent on the other. Arabia lay at a focal point where world faiths as well as political forces met, but here the physical characteristics of the land had prevented rapid spread of a definite creed and permitted the ancestral religion to survive. All was indeed not well with this religion. Neither the Bedouin nor the merchants or the citizens of the small agricultural towns had any strong religious sentiment, and they therefore left intact the traditional religious forms, which recognized both a number of local deities of each sex, and, above them, an almighty Lord of the heavens, known simply as God, in Arabic, Allah. Yet little interest was taken in religious questions. The reasons why the sanctuary of the Kaaba, a black stone probably of meteoric origin built into the wall of a rectangular edifice, was still carefully maintained, were that it secured the inviolability of Makkah, and that the yearly pilgrimage made to it by the surrounding tribes brought financial advantages to the city's inhabitants. As has been the case in every age and among every nation, a life so essentially worldly, so indifferent to matters of metaphysics, could not satisfy those whose minds were open to religious questions. On these speculatively inclined souls, influences emanating from the surrounding world religions were, in the early 7th century, at work. In Arabia itself, communities of Jews were established who had organized themselves like Arab tribes and largely adopted Arabic speech, but held fast to the Mosaic law. In North Arabia and the Yemen, these Jews had been able to win proselytes, including at times local princes. In addition were to be found a few Manichaeans, followers of a dualistic religion which had arisen in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century and spread to Persia and also to Egypt, North Africa, and other parts. Much more important were the Christian influences. These had penetrated the country in many forms, in the Monophysite form from Syria and Mesopotamia, and from Persian territory in the Nestorian form. For long past, the Arab tribes settled by the East Romans and the Persians as frontier garrisons on the margins of the fertile lands of Syria and Mesopotamia, respectively, had for the most part adopted the Christian faith. From here, and at the same time from the Yaman, then under Christian Abyssinian rule, it had penetrated to the interior of the peninsula. A not inconsiderable number of tribes had, at least superficially, turned to Christianity. At the Yemenite city of Sana'a and on the island of Socotra, there were Nestorian bishops. Central Arabia, together with the region around Makkah, still lacked organized Christian settlements, but influences derived from the teachings of Jesus deeply stirred the emotions of the seekers after faith above mentioned. To these was added the influence of the Jewish communities, which should not be underestimated. Such men, called Hanifs, of whom there were probably quite a number, and whose names are partly known to us, made a certain impression upon their environment, and this was supplemented by an organized Christian missionary activity, carried in perhaps in part directly by Hanifs, but in part also by real missionaries of that faith. The preachings of these persons had a certain basically identical pattern. After proclaiming the end of the world, when good would be rewarded and the wicked punished, they pointed to God's creative might, revealed in nature and in the vital rain, a proof to men of his goodness, but also a summons to them for a corresponding and morally earnest change of heart. It may be inferred that once among the hearers of such a sermon was a man who came from an honorable but not well-to-do family of Makkah, who, having been orphaned when very young and brought up among relatives, had in his youth performed quite menial tasks such as tending cattle, and who only after obtaining the post of bailiff to a rich widow named Khadija, and after the latter's decision in her 40th year to marry him, had, at the age of 25, come into settled and comfortable financial circumstances. And that's the beginning of Islam.